This is a true horror story about a completely silent, deeply unsettling real experience I had after finding a 20-year-old SD card hidden inside the walls of an abandoned house. Most people actively browse the internet late at night looking for a fictional scary story to experience a brief, entertaining thrill before safely drifting off to sleep, completely secure in the undeniable belief that their locked doors provide an absolute, impenetrable barrier against the unpredictable, dark chaos of the outside world. But when you physically uncover undeniable, recorded proof of a terrifying reality that completely defies all natural, logical explanation, that comforting illusion of absolute safety is permanently and violently shattered, leaving you completely trapped in a waking paranoia that entirely overwrites your foundational understanding of the world. My name is Thomas, and I have worked for the past 12 years as a commercial demolition contractor in the deeply isolated, heavily wooded rural outskirts of the Pacific Northwest. My job essentially consists of meticulously walking through condemned, completely forgotten, rotting properties to ensure they are entirely empty of hazardous materials or structural dangers before the heavy machinery arrives to permanently, violently tear them down to the bare dirt. 2 weeks ago, my crew was assigned to a sprawling, slightly outdated, heavily overgrown 2-story farmhouse located at the absolute very end of a deeply isolated, dead-end dirt road. The property had reportedly been completely abandoned for over 20 years, the original owners having simply vanished without a single trace, leaving the massive, isolated house to slowly, silently rot away under the heavy, suffocating canopy of ancient pine trees. When I first stepped inside the freezing, deeply stagnant air of the front hallway, the heavy, dead silence of the abandoned house violently pressed against my inner eardrums. The entire structure felt incredibly, impossibly heavy, completely saturated with a deeply malevolent, unseen presence that actively squeezed the precious oxygen right out of my tight chest. I spent hours meticulously walking through the damp, decaying rooms, my heavy work boots loudly crunching over broken glass and rotting floorboards. But when I reached the absolute end of the long, dark, central hallway on the second floor, I stepped into a room that immediately made my ancient, primal survival instincts violently scream in pure, unadulterated panic. It was clearly a highly outdated, rotting nursery, the walls covered in heavily peeling, faded pastel wallpaper, a completely broken, rotting wooden crib sitting perfectly still in the absolute dead center of the freezing room. I was systematically checking the dark corners with my heavy flashlight when the harsh, white beam caught a small, highly unnatural reflection hiding deep inside a broken heating vent near the high plaster ceiling. I carefully reached my thick, gloved hand inside the sharp metal duct and pulled out a small, heavy, completely broken plastic nursery camera. The external casing was completely shattered, heavily covered in 2 decades of thick, suffocating dust, but when I meticulously pried the plastic open, I found a completely intact, highly outdated, 20-year-old SD card still securely slotted inside the internal motherboard. I genuinely, foolishly believed I had simply found a discarded, forgotten piece of someone's mundane family history, a totally harmless digital artifact left behind to quietly rot. But something felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally, and impossibly wrong about the exact, highly specific way the broken camera had been actively, intentionally hidden completely out of sight inside the metal vent, explicitly angled to secretly observe the room without being detected. I carefully placed the small plastic square into my heavy jacket pocket, completely unaware that I was actively bringing a profoundly terrifying, highly toxic paranormal artifact directly into my own isolated, heavily secured home. That night, I was sitting entirely alone in the pitch-black darkness of my home office, the ambient temperature outside having aggressively plummeted significantly below freezing, completely trapping my isolated apartment in a dead, heavy, winter silence. The only source of illumination in the heavily pressurized, suffocating room was the harsh, pale, sickly blue glow of my laptop monitor heavily reflecting against my sweating, pale face. I meticulously inserted the old SD card into the digital reader, the computer taking several agonizing, heavily pressurized minutes to slowly process the highly outdated, corrupted data formatting. When the digital file directory finally loaded on the glowing screen, I found exactly one single, massive video file taking up the entire capacity of the tiny storage drive. The file had absolutely no title, no metadata, and no creation date, just a long, random string of meaningless numbers. I took a deep, violently trembling breath, my dry, burning eyes completely locked onto the monitor, and clicked play. The media player buffered for a fraction of a single, agonizing second before the silent, high-definition, heavily compressed black and white infrared night vision footage violently snapped into sharp focus. The camera perfectly captured the wide, downward angle of a large, dark bedroom, entirely different from the ruined nursery where I had originally found the device. The room was bathed in the harsh, abrasive, high-contrast visual static of cheap night vision lenses, heavily mixed with the incredibly faint, chaotic, flickering light of several small candles placed randomly around the edges of the room. The absolute most deeply unsettling detail was the profound, complete lack of audio. The digital file was entirely, heavily, and deafeningly silent, completely stripping the environment of any natural, comforting background noise and forcing my exhausted brain to solely process the horrifying visual data. In the absolute dead center of the illuminated frame, lying perfectly, rigidly still on a large, heavy wooden bed, was a single, pale person. The heavy blankets were pulled up perfectly to their chin, their face barely visible in the dark shadows, their body completely, utterly motionless. Standing meticulously, perfectly spaced around the immediate perimeter of the bed were exactly 5 completely silent, towering, pale figures. I watched the silent, black and white video play out, desperately, pathetically trying to rationally explain the deeply bizarre, highly unsettling scene using cold, hard, desperate logic. I immediately, forcefully told myself that I had simply stumbled upon a highly private, deeply personal morning ritual, a quiet, somber wake being held in the absolute dead of the night for the person lying motionless on the mattress. I tried to convince my rapidly fracturing mind that the heavy, static stillness of the room was just a profound expression of deep, earthly grief. But that wasn't the worst part. As I continued to stare intensely at the silent, flickering digital recording, a creeping, highly unnatural anomaly slowly began to violently assault my rapidly breaking sanity. The heavy, ambient atmosphere of my own home office suddenly felt suffocatingly heavy, actively mirroring the intense, overwhelming, and highly unnatural presence violently bleeding directly out of the digital recording. That's when I noticed it. I watched the digital timestamp quietly ticking forward in the bottom corner of the screen, completely realizing that I had been actively watching the exact same silent footage for over 15 continuous, unbroken minutes. But in all that heavy, agonizing time, absolutely nobody in the dark room had moved naturally. Human beings possess an incredibly subtle, highly predictable biological fluidity. We constantly shift our heavy physical weight, we naturally sway slightly as we breathe, we unconsciously adjust our posture, our joints subtly twitch. But the 5 pale figures standing entirely around the bed were completely, terrifyingly, and impossibly static. They maintained a heavy, statuesque, highly predatory stillness that fundamentally and aggressively defied the immutable, unbreakable laws of biology and physics. They did not shift. They did not blink. They did not exhibit even a single, microscopic, biological tremor. They stood perfectly, flawlessly still for impossible lengths of time, exactly like heavy, unyielding stone statues deliberately placed in the absolute darkest corners of the room. Furthermore, as I meticulously analyzed the person lying entirely on the bed, a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, toxic adrenaline violently tore straight down my rigid spine. The sleeping person never moved even once. The heavy blankets covering their chest absolutely did not rhythmically rise and fall with the natural intake of oxygen. There was absolutely no biological breathing, no shifting in their sleep, nothing but a profound, heavily dense, absolute void of life. The creeping, sickening realization that I was actively watching a completely unnatural, deeply terrifying gathering entirely paralyzed my freezing lungs. I couldn't explain it. There was absolutely no logical, earthly reason for this horrifying, silent display, but a heavy, hypnotic, deeply invasive compulsion actively commanded my trembling hand to keep dragging the small digital progress bar backward and forward, frantically replaying the silent, corrupted footage over and over again because something felt profoundly, undeniably wrong but was impossible to easily explain. I leaned extremely close to the glowing monitor, my clammy, violently sweating hands gripping the smooth plastic edge of my wooden desk so incredibly tightly that my knuckles turned completely, painfully white. I desperately, intensely focused my burning, dry eyes directly onto the pale, heavily shadowed faces of the 5 towering figures standing around the bed. The flickering, chaotic candlelight heavily bounced off their features, heavily distorted by the aggressive digital pixelation of the cheap infrared lens. I slowly, agonizingly utilized the software's digital magnification tool, painfully zooming the digital video feed to 200%, focusing entirely on the figure standing at the absolute foot of the bed. The digital image immediately broke down into heavily distorted, chunky, chaotic gray blocks, but the horrific zoom only served to violently reveal a truth so profoundly disturbing that it permanently poisoned my entire existence. As the pale, hollow features slowly came into sharp, horrifying focus, I quickly paused the video and aggressively dragged the zoomed frame to look at the second figure standing on the left side of the mattress. I completely stopped breathing, my frantic, uneven heartbeat completely stalling dead in my tight chest. I checked the third figure. Then the fourth. Then the fifth. The mind-shattering, impossible reality violently collapsed right in front of my wide, disbelieving eyes. They were not just a random group of mourning people. All of their faces looked perfectly, flawlessly, and mathematically identical. It was completely, fundamentally wrong, a deeply sickening, anatomical disaster that actively rejected the natural, earthly symmetry of humanity. They possessed the exact same smooth, unyielding, hollow porcelain structure, entirely devoid of any unique, natural characteristics or earthly emotion. It wasn't the natural similarity of identical twins, it was the terrifying, highly artificial exactness of a cloned, unblinking entity actively multiplying its massive, heavy bulk to surround its completely helpless, unmoving prey. I sat perfectly, rigidly still in the heavy leather chair, my rapid, terrified breath forming thick, highly visible white clouds of condensation in the freezing indoor air, actively realizing that this was absolutely a true horror story actively unfolding directly on my screen. I aggressively paused the silent footage one final, agonizing time, the glowing digital timestamp permanently freezing at exactly 42 minutes into the impossible recording. The digital zoom was completely locked onto the specific identical face of the figure standing in the far, upper right corner of the dark bedroom. I stared deeply, helplessly into the pixelated, hollow voids of its pale, unyielding features, my rational brain violently screaming in pure, absolute panic. The figure was not looking down at the unmoving body on the heavy bed like the rest of the identical statues. It had slightly, deliberately, and with flawlessly smooth, physics-defying mechanical rotation, tilted its heavy, identical head completely to the side. Its hollow, unblinking, bottomless dark voids were perfectly, flawlessly angled straight upward, piercing entirely through the heavy darkness of the room. The absolute, soul-crushing terror violently anchored my freezing body to the chair. That is when I undeniably realized that the identical, towering figure standing silently in the 20-year-old footage was staring intensely, directly, and with terrifying mathematical precision straight into the hidden lens of the nursery camera. I could not stop watching the heavily corrupted video files, completely trapped in a suffocating, deeply hypnotic obsession that rapidly turned this true horror story into a waking, endless nightmare. After discovering that pristine, 20-year-old SD card hidden deeply inside the decaying walls of that abandoned suburban house, my entire existence had been violently reduced to sitting entirely alone in the pitch-black darkness of my home office, staring intensely at the harsh, glowing computer monitor. I spent endless, agonizing hours looping the completely silent, grainy, black and white footage of that dimly lit bedroom, my dry, burning eyes meticulously scanning every single microscopic, gray pixel for a logical, earthly explanation that my exhausted mind could finally accept. But the more I obsessively watched the silent recording, the more I realized that the digital data was behaving in deeply impossible, fundamentally wrong ways that entirely defied the natural laws of recorded media. The glowing digital timestamps located in the bottom right corner of the media player absolutely refused to follow a linear, logical progression. They would silently, steadily tick forward for a few normal seconds, seamlessly and impossibly skip backward by 3 entire hours, and then violently jump forward by several days, all while the visual, atmospheric scene in the recorded bedroom remained completely, terrifyingly static. I started to notice highly disturbing, unnatural patterns hidden deep within the heavy visual noise of the cheap camera lens. There were exactly 5 identical people standing perfectly, rigidly still in a tight circle around the heavy wooden bed in the center of the room, but whenever the corrupted digital file produced a heavy, swirling wave of gray visual static, their physical positions would subtly, inexplicably change completely between the broken frames. 1 second, a tall figure would be standing motionless at the absolute foot of the bed, and in the very next microscopic, glitching frame, they would be hovering silently near the closed wooden bedroom door. Yet, through dozens of hours of continuous, unbroken footage, I absolutely never saw a single person actually taking a physical step, and nobody was ever seen physically entering or leaving the dark room. The heavy wooden door remained perfectly, permanently shut, sealing them inside a suffocating, timeless void. That's when things started to change, and my rational, logical mind began to heavily, irreparably fracture under the immense psychological pressure. I noticed that the small, flickering flames of the wax candles placed sporadically around the dark room were moving in a highly unnatural, physics-defying manner. The tiny, glowing points of light were occasionally moving completely backward, the thin trails of dark smoke actively descending back down into the burning wicks exactly as if time itself was aggressively reversing inside that specific room, but the 5 identical people remained perfectly frozen in place, completely unaffected by the temporal distortion. And then, the absolute most terrifying, mind-breaking detail aggressively revealed itself to my exhausted, sleep-deprived brain. As I frantically replayed the silent footage for the 100th agonizing time, the 5 identical figures occasionally appeared slightly, terrifyingly closer to the camera lens. They absolutely weren't taking earthly, physical steps forward, but their pale, completely featureless faces were undeniably growing larger, slowly dominating more of the digital frame with every single playback loop. It felt exactly, sickeningly like the digital footage was not a fixed, static recording of a past event, but a fluid, living, breathing window into a dark dimension, and I began to seriously, terrifyingly question whether the video file was actively, malevolently changing on its own in direct response to being continuously watched. I desperately wanted to dismiss the entire ordeal as a highly fabricated, fictional scary story crafted by a clever digital editor, but living through a deeply traumatizing real experience permanently strips away your comforting, biological denial, leaving you completely exposed to the impossible truth. The absolute breaking point violently arrived when I forcefully paused the playing video on a severely corrupted, heavily pixelated frame. Through the heavy, swirling digital distortion, one of the identical figures standing in the absolute darkest corner of the room seemed to have subtly shifted its blank, dead expression. Its pale, smooth features were briefly contorted into a wide, highly unnatural, deeply malicious smile that lasted for only a single, microscopic digital frame before violently snapping perfectly back to a blank, lifeless stare. I couldn't explain it. The intense, overwhelming psychological pressure violently pushed me to my absolute breaking point, forcing me to aggressively seek concrete, physical answers in the real world before my sanity completely shattered. The very next afternoon, under the pale, cold, gray light of an overcast sky, I drove my car slowly back to the decaying, abandoned house situated deep in the isolated, freezing woods, desperately needing to prove to myself that the room in the horrific video was just an empty, forgotten, rotting space. I carefully stepped over the decaying, collapsed wooden porch and quietly, cautiously entered the suffocating, silent structure, the heavy, toxic smell of damp, rotting wood and ancient, undisturbed dust instantly filling my tight, cramping lungs. I moved slowly and meticulously down the dark, heavily shadowed central hallway, my rapid, uneven heartbeat hammering aggressively against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped, panicked bird, until I finally found the specific, arched doorway from the 20-year-old footage. I slowly, agonizingly pushed the heavy, swollen oak door open, and a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, unadulterated primal dread tore straight down my spine, instantly paralyzing my rigid legs. The bedroom from the impossible footage still existed in perfect, deeply terrifying preservation. The faded, yellow floral wallpaper clinging desperately to the decaying, crumbling drywall matched the digital recording perfectly, completely down to the exact peeling corners and water-stained patterns. The heavy, dark wooden bed frame was still sitting exactly in the absolute dead center of the freezing room, looking entirely untouched by the violent passing of 2 long decades. But something felt wrong, fundamentally, impossibly wrong about the physical atmosphere of the space. I stood perfectly, rigidly still in the open doorway, my wide, unblinking eyes carefully scanning the silent environment. An incredibly thick, heavy, gray layer of completely undisturbed dust covered absolutely everything in the decaying room, heavily blanketing the rotting floorboards, the cracked window sills, and the top of the heavy doorframe like a thick winter snow. However, the specific, polished floorboards immediately surrounding the heavy wooden bed were completely, flawlessly clean. There was absolutely no dust, no debris, and no decay in the exact, specific spots where the 5 identical figures had been standing in the video, exactly as if the physical space was still being actively, constantly occupied by unseen, heavy, static bodies violently repelling the passage of time. The dead, heavily pressurized silence of the isolated, abandoned house suddenly felt incredibly, impossibly heavy, a dense, static void actively and aggressively crushing my highly sensitive inner eardrums. I immediately started feeling an intense, highly malevolent presence pressing heavily against my exposed, trembling back, the distinct, deeply paralyzing, sickening sensation of being meticulously, patiently watched from the pitch-black, empty corners of the quiet room. I absolutely didn't run blindly into the hallway, and I didn't shout out in panic. I simply, slowly turned my rigid body around and walked deliberately out of that suffocating house with a terrifying, absolute, world-ending certainty that I was no longer the apex predator in my own waking reality, but merely vulnerable prey trespassing in a dark, ancient domain. I drove entirely back to my secure, locked home in complete, deafening silence, entirely consumed by the raw, screaming, animalistic fear that had completely and permanently saturated my fragile soul. Late that exact same night, sitting completely alone in my freezing, dark home office, the heavy, hypnotic, invasive compulsion violently forced me to open the corrupted video file one last, agonizing time, desperately needing to cross-reference the physical, dusty room I had just seen with the impossible digital recording. The harsh, pale blue light from the glowing monitor heavily illuminated my pale, violently sweating face as I watched the silent, black and white, looping scene play out. But as I stared deeply and intensely into the static footage, looking entirely past the 5 identical figures surrounding the heavy wooden bed, I noticed something completely new that permanently, violently destroyed the final, remaining fragments of my rational mind. I forced my burning eyes to look at the extreme, lower bottom edge of the digital frame, the specific, empty space where the invisible person physically holding the digital camera would logically be standing in the room. The camera angle was tilted slightly, highly unnaturally upward, perfectly capturing a dark, heavy, highly reflective mirror hanging securely on the peeling wall directly behind the bed. In the dark, heavily pixelated reflection of that dirty mirror, I could finally, undeniably see the physical form of the person operating the camera. There is now a figure standing perfectly, terrifyingly still directly behind the camera lens, silently recording the entire impossible, timeless scene. And as my violently shaking hand grabbed the mouse and aggressively zoomed in on the grainy, distorted, dark reflection in the glass, the warm blood completely froze in my tired veins. That towering, silent figure standing perfectly still behind the digital lens had the exact same, impossible, identical, unblinking face as all the others. I could not stop obsessively thinking about the heavily corrupted, pixelated digital files trapped on that tiny, fragile piece of plastic, my exhausted mind violently trapped in a suffocating, endless loop of terrifying, impossible questions that absolutely demanded a physical resolution. The profound, creeping realization that the dark, silent footage captured on the incredibly old SD card might not just be a static, unchangeable recording of a distant, forgotten past, but a deeply fluid, actively shifting digital nightmare, completely shattered the final, lingering remnants of my rational sanity. Living through an active, deeply traumatizing true horror story violently strips away every single logical defense mechanism you possess, heavily poisoning your perception of reality and replacing your comforting, earthly logic with a raw, screaming, animalistic fear that entirely consumes your soul. I desperately needed to know the absolute truth, completely driven by a dark, heavy, hypnotic, and profoundly invasive compulsion that aggressively commanded my trembling body to return to the source of the impossible infection. I forcefully grabbed my heavy winter coat, my car keys, and my fully charged laptop, entirely ignoring the deep, ancient, primal survival instincts violently screaming in the deepest, darkest corners of my exhausted brain, actively begging me to simply throw the fragile memory card into a blazing fire and completely walk away from the nightmare. I drove for over 2 agonizing, heavily pressurized hours deep into the pitch-black, freezing, entirely isolated rural countryside, the dark, winding, empty asphalt roads completely swallowed by the massive, towering, ancient pine trees that seemed to aggressively lean inward, actively trying to crush my small, moving vehicle in the dead of the freezing night. The ambient temperature outside plummeted significantly below freezing, a bitter, biting winter chill that violently seeped through the metal frame of the car and settled directly into the marrow of my aching bones, perfectly mirroring the intense, overwhelming psychological dread pooling heavily in the very bottom of my empty stomach. When I finally pulled my car onto the long, overgrown, deeply rutted dirt driveway leading entirely back up to the decaying, abandoned 2-story house, the sprawling, rotting property looked infinitely more menacing, vastly heavier, and terrifyingly more hostile than it had during the bright, comforting hours of the daylight. I slowly turned off the car engine, the heavy, sudden, static silence of the isolated woods immediately pressing violently against my inner eardrums exactly like a massive, invisible, crushing weight, completely isolating me from the rest of the natural, breathing, safely living world. This was absolutely not just a simple, entertaining scary story that I could pause and walk away from, this was a terrifying, suffocating real experience that was actively, aggressively pulling me deep into its dark, unblinking gravity. I slowly, carefully stepped out into the freezing, dead, windless night air, my heavy boots crunching loudly and violently against the thick layer of glittering, white frost completely coating the dead, brown weeds surrounding the rotting wooden porch. The massive, decaying house loomed silently and patiently over me in the pitch-black darkness, its shattered, empty windows staring completely blankly out into the deep woods exactly like the dark, hollow, bottomless eye sockets of a massive, ancient, buried skull waiting to be unearthed. I slowly, agonizingly climbed the completely rotting, highly unstable wooden porch steps, my clammy, violently sweating hand reaching out and tightly gripping the cold, rusted brass doorknob of the heavy front door. I pushed the solid wooden door open, the rusted, decaying metal hinges screaming violently and deafeningly in the dead silence of the night, and stepped entirely over the dark threshold, allowing the heavy, oppressive, suffocating darkness of the abandoned interior to completely and entirely swallow my physical body. But something felt fundamentally, terribly wrong the exact, specific microscopic second I stepped inside the isolated structure. The ambient atmosphere inside the decaying, abandoned hallway absolutely did not feel like a structure that had been completely left to rot and violently decompose for over 20 long, uninterrupted years. Instead of the natural, chaotic, biological decay of an abandoned property, the house possessed a heavy, terrifying, deeply unnatural stillness, a pristine, static preservation that completely defied the immutable, absolute laws of earthly time and physical entropy. The stale, stagnant, freezing indoor air was incredibly thick, heavily saturated with a profoundly toxic, deeply unnatural, highly malevolent energy that aggressively squeezed the precious, thin oxygen right out of my tight, cramping lungs, making it incredibly, painfully difficult to draw a single, natural breath. I slowly clicked on my heavy, high-powered LED flashlight, the harsh, piercing, blinding white beam violently cutting through the thick, suffocating black void, heavily illuminating the rotting, peeling floral wallpaper and the thick, completely undisturbed layers of gray dust heavily coating the rotting hardwood floorboards. I completely ignored the empty, decaying living room and the dark, rotting kitchen, my entire, terrified focus exclusively locked onto the narrow, creaking wooden staircase leading directly up to the second floor, specifically drawn to the dark, isolated bedroom situated at the very absolute end of the long, pitch-black upper hallway. I slowly, meticulously climbed the decaying wooden stairs, every single agonizing, incredibly heavy footstep echoing loudly and deafeningly through the completely silent, heavily pressurized house, my frantically beating heart hammering aggressively against my tight ribs exactly like a trapped, panicked bird desperately trying to escape a cage. When I finally reached the open, heavy wooden doorway of the specific, isolated master bedroom at the end of the corridor, I completely stopped breathing, a massive, freezing shockwave of pure, unadulterated primal dread violently tearing straight down my rigid spine. The bedroom was completely, flawlessly, and terrifyingly preserved, exactly, perfectly matching the horrifying, impossible scene captured on the pixelated, 20-year-old digital footage on the SD card. The heavy, stagnant air inside the dark room smelled strongly and sickeningly of old, decaying, melting wax, a thick, nauseating, highly unnatural, sweet metallic odor that heavily coated the back of my dry throat and made my empty stomach violently churn. Completely scattered across the rotting, dusty hardwood floorboards, perfectly encircling the massive, decaying wooden bed frame sitting silently in the absolute dead center of the room, were dozens of thick, heavy, completely melted red and black candles. The thick, congealed, colored wax had deeply melted and actively seeped entirely into the physical cracks of the old floorboards, drying into strange, highly disturbing, intricate, chaotic patterns that looked exactly like dark, frozen puddles of heavy, ancient blood perfectly preserving a deeply sinister, unholy ritual. The heavy, suffocating silence of the isolated room was completely deafening, a thick, static, highly pressurized void that completely lacked the normal, natural, microscopic sounds of mice scurrying in the decaying walls or the freezing winter wind violently rattling the cracked window panes. It was a flawless, terrifying, perfect, three-dimensional physical recreation of the digital nightmare I had watched on my glowing computer monitor, a heavy, unblinking trap patiently waiting for its final, necessary component to arrive. That's when I noticed it. As I slowly, carefully, and agonizingly swept the harsh, piercing white beam of my heavy flashlight across the dark, rotting plaster walls of the preserved bedroom, the terrifying, mind-breaking, impossible reality of the true horror story violently began to heavily bleed completely outside the confines of the corrupted digital file and entirely into the waking, physical world. I started catching incredibly brief, highly subtle, terrifyingly silent peripheral glimpses of the exact same, completely identical, pale, hollow, unyielding porcelain faces that had silently surrounded the massive bed in the dark footage. At first, I desperately, pathetically tried to convince my rapidly fracturing, entirely exhausted mind that I was simply experiencing a severe, highly localized visual hallucination directly caused by my extreme sleep deprivation, severe anxiety, and the highly toxic, stale air of the abandoned house. But the horrifying, impossible sightings aggressively and violently escalated. When the harsh, bright beam of my flashlight briefly washed over a large, heavily cracked, incredibly dirty, antique standing mirror completely leaning against the far, dark corner of the bedroom, I physically, undeniably saw the massive, dark, towering reflection of one of the identical, pale, featureless figures standing perfectly, terrifyingly still right directly behind my own exposed, vulnerable shoulder, its hollow, bottomless, pitch-black void staring intensely and malevolently at the back of my freezing neck. I instinctively, violently snapped my entire body around, completely terrified, but the dark, physical space directly behind me was perfectly, flawlessly empty, the dense, heavy shadows pooling deeply in the room revealing absolutely no physical intruder. I should have left, but I didn't. The heavy, hypnotic, invasive, deeply buried compulsion forcefully anchored my trembling legs entirely to the rotting floorboards. I slowly turned my terrified gaze to a highly decayed, incredibly faded, black and white antique photograph hanging severely crookedly on the peeling plaster wall exactly next to the closet door. The photograph logically should have depicted a normal, boring, historical family portrait from a completely forgotten century, but the dark, highly pixelated, deeply corrupted visual data from the digital SD card had actively, aggressively overwritten the physical, printed reality of the old photograph. Staring back at me from inside the dusty, cracked glass frame, completely replacing the historical human faces, were 6 identical, towering, heavily shadowed figures wearing pale, featureless porcelain masks, their heads tilted slightly, smoothly, and highly unnaturally exactly toward the center of the frame, actively observing me from inside the physical photograph. Out of the extreme, blurry, highly sensitive corner of my left eye, I clearly, undeniably saw a massive, tall, dark silhouette completely silently gliding across the open, pitch-black threshold of the bedroom doorway, a heavy, towering figure perfectly and effortlessly blending into the deep, suffocating darkness of the long hallway, completely ignoring the immutable, unbreakable laws of physical matter and earthly gravity. The massive, dark, unblinking entity did not make a single, microscopic sound as it moved, entirely lacking the heavy shifting of physical weight or the biological, rhythmic bobbing of a living, walking human being. The creeping, agonizing, highly toxic realization violently slammed into my chest exactly like a massive, heavy iron sledgehammer, instantly shattering my entire understanding of time, space, and linear reality. I became increasingly, terrifyingly unsure whether the highly corrupted, pixelated digital footage I had meticulously watched on the old, fragile memory card was actually 20 years old at all. I couldn't explain it. Was the digital video an ancient, forgotten recording of a dark, historical event, or was it a highly advanced, deeply paranormal, completely impossible live feed actively showing me the very same terrifying reality that was presently unfolding around my physical body in the absolute dead of the night? The heavy, crushing, deeply malevolent presence actively saturating the stagnant, freezing air of the abandoned bedroom suddenly spiked to an unbearable, highly toxic degree, actively drawing my terrified, unblinking eyes directly to the absolute dead center of the dark room. The massive, decaying, incredibly heavy wooden bed frame sat perfectly, terrifyingly still amidst the dark, frozen puddles of melted wax, heavily covered in incredibly thick, severely rotting, deeply stained, heavy gray blankets that completely obscured the physical shape resting silently underneath. The sleeping person perfectly hidden beneath the heavy, dusty blankets became the absolute, central, terrifying mystery of this entire, impossible real experience, a dark, heavy focal point that violently anchored my fracturing sanity to the room. I stood perfectly, rigidly still, my violent, terrified, rapid breath actively forming thick, highly visible, chaotic white clouds of freezing condensation in the pale beam of the flashlight, my unblinking eyes entirely locked onto the heavy, completely unmoving mound in the center of the mattress. A chaotic storm of pure, unadulterated, unanswerable questions violently flooded my completely exhausted, terrified brain. Who exactly was lying completely, perfectly still beneath those rotting, heavy covers in this deeply isolated, entirely abandoned property? Are they completely, physically dead, their biological body entirely decaying into nothingness over the past 20 years while being endlessly, patiently watched by the massive, identical, towering entities? Or are they still somehow, impossibly, deeply sleeping, entirely trapped in an endless, suffocating, waking nightmare, completely paralyzed by the massive, crushing psychological pressure of the unblinking, pale masks surrounding their vulnerable, resting head? Are they being actively, heavily guarded by the dark figures, or are they being meticulously, patiently prepared for a deeply sinister, completely unknown, horrifying ancient purpose? Or, perhaps most terrifyingly of all, are they simply, quietly, and entirely patiently waiting for something highly specific to finally, undeniably arrive in the dark room and permanently complete the impossible, dark cycle? The heavy, static, pressurized blankets absolutely did not rise and fall with the natural, biological, rhythmic motion of human breathing, remaining completely, flawlessly, and terrifyingly flat and undisturbed in the freezing, stale air, but the profound, overwhelming, highly toxic aura actively radiating from the bed was intensely, profoundly, undeniably alive. I absolutely did not dare to step forward, completely refusing to reach out with my trembling, clammy hand and physically pull back the heavy, rotting, dusty gray fabric to reveal the horrifying, impossible, mind-shattering truth resting silently in the absolute dark. The heavy, dark atmosphere of the room actively demanded a complete, total psychological submission, and I knew with absolute, undeniable certainty that physically disturbing the sleeping figure would instantly, violently, and permanently end my fragile existence. Instead, heavily driven by an overwhelming, completely irrational, desperate, screaming need to permanently finalize the terrifying loop, I slowly, deliberately reached into the large, deep pocket of my heavy winter coat and carefully pulled out my glowing, fully charged laptop. The harsh, bright, pale blue light of the digital screen instantly, sharply illuminating my pale, heavily sweating, entirely terrified face in the freezing darkness. The incredibly old, highly fragile plastic SD card was already completely inserted into the side port, the corrupted, heavily pixelated digital video file completely queued up and patiently waiting to be entirely resolved. I completely balanced the heavy laptop on my violently trembling right forearm, my cold, stiff, completely white left fingers gently resting exactly on the smooth plastic touchpad. I needed to see the final, completely unedited, heavily corrupted seconds of the impossible video, desperately hoping to find a logical, earthly explanation, completely unaware that I was actively, deliberately sealing my own horrifying fate. I slowly, agonizingly clicked the small, digital play button, entirely allowing the completely silent, grayscale, highly degraded infrared security footage to smoothly resume exactly where I had completely abandoned it just hours ago in the supposed safety of my own home office. The silent, pixelated video played smoothly, perfectly displaying the exact, physical layout of the massive, dark bedroom I was presently standing inside. The glowing, highly corrupted digital timestamp located exactly in the bottom right corner of the media player silently ticked forward, the heavily degraded pixels jumping and swirling chaotically in the dense digital shadows. At the absolute start of the video clip, standing perfectly, terrifyingly still exactly around the heavy, dark edges of the massive wooden bed frame, there were precisely, undeniably 6 completely identical, impossibly tall, highly unnatural people. They were wearing the exact same pale, smooth, hollow, completely unyielding porcelain masks, their incredibly long, pale, spindly limbs hanging completely limp and totally lifeless at their sides, their featureless, empty, bottomless dark faces tilted slightly, smoothly downward, silently and patiently observing the unmoving, heavy mound of gray blankets resting in the very center. But as the final, heavily degraded, violently glitching 15 seconds of the silent digital recording actively played out on the glowing screen, the impossible, mind-breaking, deeply terrifying final twist aggressively revealed itself, permanently and violently destroying the final, fragile, clinging remnants of my human sanity. The highly sensitive, cheap infrared lens of the camera, capturing the footage slowly, smoothly, and with absolute, deeply mechanical, flawless precision, actively panned slightly, deliberately to the right, completely moving away from the heavy bed to perfectly, clearly capture the wide, open, dark threshold of the wooden bedroom doorway. The dense, heavy, suffocating digital shadows completely pooling in the entrance slowly, deliberately parted, actively revealing a completely new, horrifyingly clear addition to the impossible, ancient gathering. Now there are undeniably 7. Standing perfectly, rigidly still exactly in the very center of the dark, open doorway in the video, actively joining the unblinking, patient vigil of the identical masked entities, was the 7th figure. It absolutely was not wearing a pale, hollow porcelain mask. It absolutely was not impossibly tall, and its limbs were not unnaturally, horrifyingly elongated. The harsh, invisible infrared light of the camera perfectly, flawlessly, and undeniably illuminated its entirely human, highly recognizable features, capturing exactly the physical details of a heavy, dark winter coat, pale, sweating, completely terrified features, and the distinct, incredibly bright, glowing rectangular light of a modern laptop screen heavily reflecting directly against its wide, unblinking, burning eyes. The completely paralyzing, deeply sickening, massively toxic realization instantly stopped my frantically beating heart entirely dead in my chest, completely freezing the hot blood rapidly circulating in my tired veins. The 7th figure patiently, silently, and eternally captured in the 20-year-old digital recording, was absolutely, undeniably me. I slowly, agonizingly raised my wide, terrified, completely unblinking eyes entirely away from the glowing digital screen, staring directly, helplessly into the pitch-black, heavily pressurized, freezing void of the preserved, silent bedroom, entirely aware that the 6 towering, pale, unblinking masks had finally, completely, and slowly turned their massive heads to look directly at me. I have absolutely no idea who or what is actually sleeping silently under the heavy blankets, but they have clearly been patiently waiting a very long time for the seventh watcher to finally arrive and complete the circle.